Good evening, everyone. I will like to call this meeting to order and would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded Algonquin territory this evening and would like to thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us on their land. I would just like to note for tonight that we should only have the reps for COW budget present at this meeting. We do have a COW Committee of the Whole meeting, special meeting that's following the budget meeting this evening. And non-voting reps can join the special meeting following this one. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to present report 21-012, which is the 2021 revised estimates, and also to present report 21-013, which is related to the 2021-2022 budget process. And so this is our first budget meeting for the 21-22 budget. And I'm expecting a lot of questions this evening and lots of conversations. So I will welcome all of you to tonight's meeting and just like to see if there is a mover to approve tonight's agenda. Thank you, Trustee Blackburn. Are there any changes to tonight's agenda? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor? Okay, thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, seeing none, thank you. There are no delegations on tonight's agenda, so we'll move right into report 21-012 and over to Director to introduce the report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. Tonight we'll be providing trustees with the revised estimates for the 2020-2021 school year. As everyone knows, it has been a complex year as we have and continue to respond to the changing reality of schooling in the context of a pandemic. Our reporting will outline some of the factors that have impacted our resources as well as resource allocation. I'd like to take this moment just in advance of the reports that will come forward this evening to thank CFO Carson and the finance team for their vigilance and agility in monitoring and reconciling our financial fluctuations over the course of this year. In the second report, we will have the outline as to how it is that we will proceed forward with the budget plan and the establishment of a budget for the 2021-22 school year. Of course, we will have continued considerations for the realities of the pandemic that will continue some impact as we go into the school year. At this point, I will turn it to CFO Carson, who will take us through item 1 as well as item 2 with your direction, Chair Schwartz, without further interruption or interjection from myself. And over to you, CFO Carson.
Thank you very much. CFO, I think you need to take yourself off mute. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just before getting going, I do want to thank the Director, Mr. Gardner, and his staff have done amazing work a lot over the last 12 months as we've learned how to do this remotely and to move from what is still a strong paper-based process. They have done this in the face of increased reporting responsibilities with the ministry. It seems that every week we get a new report that someone is looking for. Having said that, it isn't just our department. The budget is developed in conjunction with our departments, our principals, our teachers, and we understand the importance. More importantly than that, is the work they've done in the first 6 months of the year. The dollars and cents are really just one way of keeping score, and the phenomenal work they've done is not always reflected purely in the dollars and cents. So not to diminish the quality of our work, and we will certainly thank you, Director, for those comments, but it has been a fall where the OCDSB has truly been a community of heroes as well as a community of character. So moving along, just before I ask Mr. Gardner to take you through the revised estimates, we will go through them in a little less detail than we have in the past. If there are questions, certainly we'll be willing to address them. I want to start by offering my appreciation to all of you, the members of the COW Budget Committee, for the dedication you've shown throughout the years. The development, recommendation, and approval of a budget is an important part of the duty of every single organization. For our school board, it's especially so, as it often creates the space where we identify opportunities and challenges to be faced as we plan and implement the activities that are going to support learning and wellness as we continue to work to create those cultures of innovation, well-being, and social responsibility. Tonight, we're beginning the next phase of this process, which is going to unfold over the coming weeks. As a first step tonight, we'll take a look at our current year's activities in financial terms as we projected in the revised estimates. Just before I ask Kevin to go through a summary of those results, I want to remind trustees, these were prepared in unusual times without the benefit of the complete and full kind of analysis we might have liked, and our analysis continues. Personally, I believe the actual deficit this year will be somewhat lower, but we wanted to make sure that in all of our estimates, we did not underestimate the potential risk we have of financial difficulty as the year proceeds. So I will turn it over to Mr. Gardner at this time, and then we can move into the budget process, and with the chair's permission, we'll handle the questions as a group later on. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, CFO Carson, and through you, Madam Chair. I do have a presentation that I'd like to share, if that's okay.
Are you able to share it? Oh, there we go.
It's up? Okay.
Yeah.
And for some reason, it doesn't show on my screen when I'm sharing, so I'm always uncertain.
It is up right now.
Okay, so we're going to be looking right now at the report 21012, which is our revised estimates. And to start off, as CFO Carson noted, we do prepare the estimates very early in the year, and we have a tendency to layer known cost changes on top of the estimates that we produce. And we also take a conservative approach to estimating changes in our revenues so that we don't want to overstate our revenues. And I believe, like CFO Carson, that these are worst case scenario. It does present a lot of risk. We show changes in both our revenues and expenses, and we'll look at those in a little bit more detail in a minute. But we are projecting a $28 million deficit this year in the revised estimates, as compared to the $17.7 million that we showed in the approved budget. So the significant increase in the costs. This here is a summary of our net results and our accumulated surplus. It provides a little bit of a historical view of where we've been and where we see we're going. As you can see, the bottom line for 2020-21 is that the net actual is a projection of the $28 million deficit. And if that was to materialize, we would see our accumulated surplus decrease to just under $12 million. And one of the things to keep in mind is that that $12 million, a good portion of that would be committed to support capital projects. And there's a little comment on that in the report itself. The significant items, as we know, COVID has had a significant effect on our enrollment. So we've seen currently within our projections, close to 2,000 fewer ADE or students in our schools. And that has a significant impact on all the different allocations that make up the grants for student needs. In total, we expect that these ADE adjustments will impact us by about $18 million. That's a decrease of $18 million. It is offset with a few other grants within the GSN allocation. In total, we did see some growth in the Indigenous education allocation as a result of the secondary courses that are grade 11 English courses that qualify for extra funding. And we also saw some adjustments to the teacher qualification and experience grant, $1.6 million increase. And that reflects our teacher demographics as at October 31st, and also increased funding that we've received from the ministry to support the employee benefit costs. The biggest change that you'll see within the revised estimates are the priorities and partnership funds grants. And those are generally related to COVID-driven funding that we've received. So the first item, we did see a significant decrease in our GSN funding, but the ministry recognized that that would have imposed a significant financial consequence on the district and all school boards, in fact. And so they provided GSN stabilization funding. So they actually provided an additional $15 million to equalize our grants to what they really look like in our original approved budget. So it assumes that's really the top up for the extra, for the lost students that we're going to be receiving. In addition to that, we have new funding to meet all the different COVID needs that have been identified, such as ventilation, remote learning, the additional teachers, and mental health, for instance. So that added an extra $12 million. And then we had our normal Ppf grants that, as you may recall, we do receive grants throughout the year on various areas. And so we did receive an extra $380,000. Some of that was the French language allocation, and also some funding for autism additional qualifications. Cool. Now, we put this slide in here. It's the COVID-related funding, and we actually just updated it today. It's not the best slide from a size perspective, but it does demonstrate the amount of funding that we are receiving in addition to our normal GSN funding. So we initially had budgeted about $5.4 million to support our, as part of the COVID grants that had been announced before we had actually passed the budget in August. Since then, they've announced another $12.4 million in confirmed grants that we had included in the revised estimates. So within the revised estimates, we have $17.8 million of COVID-related grants. Then just the other day, we had received confirmation of another $7.1 million of funding for COVID purposes. And we haven't received all the details on that, but it adds another 7.1. So that it is on top of the 17.8 million. And then, of course, we had the GSN stabilization funding. So in total, the PPF grants total $47.3 million of extra funding that the ministry is providing to support the district this year. We had also had some money provided through the GSN, a small amount of $711,000. But I think this is a good slide to show the amount of extra resources that we're receiving. And a lot of this money is the main contributor to a lot of the changes that you see in the revised estimates. Significant items, I won't dwell on all these, but we have the increased occasional teacher costs as a result of the pandemic and the requirements to quarantine. We see some savings in our student transportation costs as a result of lower transportation contract costs and reduced need for transit passes. We have increased spending on portable relocations as a result of our demographic changes, and just needs for school renewal. So that school renewal is actual funding. It may be looked at as capital, or it may be deemed to be operating. In this case, these increase our operating costs. We also have some funds set aside for the minor tangible capital assets. However, we expect that we'll be seeing an extra $1 million being devoted towards capital, because we are investing a lot in technology during the current year. We did have some significant revenue adjustments, and revenue is actually one of the big issues that we are facing with in the revised estimates. So we see our community use of schools. They rent our gymnasiums and other facilities, and we're assessing about a $2.7 million decrease in funding, or revenues, I should say. We see a $825,000 decrease in our benefit plan surplus that we had anticipated somewhat more money coming in. However, the central agreements provided for a different split, and that money will instead be directed to the Employee Life and Health Trust for benefit supports. We've seen some reduced international student fees beyond what we had originally provided for within the budget. And of course, our extended day and childcare programs are looking at a net operating deficit of $6.3 million. Those programs have seen a significant decrease in participation, particularly the extended day program. And unfortunately, we feel that we may be able to get additional funding. However, at this point, we don't have any confirmation of the funding. So we want to present the picture before any supplemental funding. If you may recall, last year, as part of the sustainability funding for our early learning programs, the ministry through the City of Ottawa actually provided additional funding to offset the deficits that had been incurred last year. So as I said, staff, we're continuing to look for revenue opportunities and looking for our cost savings within our areas to ensure that we can minimize the deficit to a more manageable level. And we continue to work with the City of Ottawa for the extended day and childcare subsidies. In fact, we actually did receive confirmation that the city is aware of and is working on our behalf also. So in summary, we are projecting a $28.1 million operating deficit. And if that was to happen, we would see a significant reduction in the flexibility for the use of our accumulated surplus. But again, I believe this is a very conservative estimate, and I expect that we will see improved results on the next forecast, and we're actively engaged in looking at our cost trends and looking at our revenue trends to try to get that as accurate as possible for the next presentation on the forecast. So with that, I'll return it to CFO Carson and for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Manager Gardner. Back to you, CFO.
Thanks, Madam Chair. On slide 11, we've outlined the normal kind of budget development cycle that our district and others across the province usually follow. Every one of us is aware that the events of last spring and summer unfolded in such a way that the activity shown on that chart had to be substantially modified. In fact, the announcement of the usual GSNs for 2020-2021 was made in June, when we're traditionally finishing the approval of a budget. In fact, all of you will remember the OCDSB was unable to be in a position to approve a compliant budget until the last week of August 2020. Last year, I said I had never entered a budget cycle with so many questions. Well, I guess we should never say never. The impact of the pandemic, the ongoing impact, the battle to control its spread changes every day. In the same way, so does our environment for decision-making as we look forward to our plans for the fall. Notwithstanding that, we are committed to do everything we can to have this budget approved in June so we can best facilitate the smooth opening of school in September 2021 and support student learning. This year, as we work on budget development, perhaps more than ever before, staff will be focusing on consolidation of what we do. The uncertainty of the timing and amounts of funding that could be made available beyond the usual GSNs means that we will need to look carefully at all areas of potential savings in order to arrive at a recommended budget that will be compliant with ministry requirements. We want to balance the risk that through the budget, we don't make early financial commitments, which might prove difficult to honor or back us into corners as we try to respond to other emerging issues as the year progresses. We need to balance that with the risk of not having the right staff in the right place at the right time. Madam Chair, I'd like to briefly review for members of the committee some of the technical pieces attached to education funding. On slide 12, we've identified that approximately 88% of our revenue flows from the GSN calculations. This is why our work is so dependent on timely information regarding those grants. And this year, those grants that will go beyond it to support safe return to schools in a continued COVID environment. On slide 13, I'd like to remind trustees that boards are required by the Education Act to approve a balanced budget. That term balance does allow for approval of the use of reserves in an amount of up to approximately 1% of the board's revenues to cover a deficit. As you are aware, for 2020-2021, that amount was increased to 2% to assist school districts in responding to the COVID emergency. Slide 14 is just a reminder that the budget is also a tool which facilitates the actual operation of our schools and organization by delegating the authorization of spending to staff in accordance with board policies and sound financial management practices. I think we'll move to slide 15 now. Every year, in order to begin the budget development process, staff needs to make assumptions. Our budget is always based on a series of these: enrollment, inflation, and cost pressures, as well as ministry priorities, which may be accompanied by specific funding. It's also based on an estimate of what might be contained in the main GSNs when they're finally released. This year, our theme is certainly going to be the need for flexibility. The range of possible changes in so many areas means that estimates are subject to far more variability than in the past. Most of these do revolve around the pandemic. Currently, the province's guidance to boards is to develop a budget with the underlying assumption that the extraordinary supports received in 2021 will not continue. Madam Chair, as noted earlier on slide 6, the district has received over $40 million in additional funding this year. 28 million tied to specific initiatives to support additional staffing, additional supportive technology, and another 14 million of stabilization funding to address the impact of enrollment decreases. This was put in place to recognize that we and other districts had already made staffing and other contractual commitments before the full impact of COVID could truly be known, and that we needed to be supported financially in fulfilling those commitments. On slide 16, we begin to outline some of the assumptions that we need to begin working with based on discussions with ministry staff, as well as colleagues across the province. As noted, for now, we are assuming the use of reserves will be limited to no more than 1% of revenues. We will continue to update our forecast to better identify what those reserves could look like by the end of the year, And as Mr. Gardner has indicated, we are in the middle of updating our forecast based on spending to the end of January 2021, and we will share that information with the trustees and with members of the Budget Committee as it becomes available. On slide 17, Madam Chair, we've highlighted the challenge we face with respect to enrollment projections this year. In the current year, we saw lower enrollment growth than we had expected, in fact, a decline. It was due to the lower rates of immigration, decisions to homeschool or private school or send students to private school in numbers that were greater than what we have seen, and deferred enrollment in kindergarten programs. So when we do our projections for the coming year, we have to ask questions. Can we count on recovering those kindergarten students? If so, how many? Will parents who chose homeschooling or moved the students to private schools begin to return to us? When will immigration begin again? And under what conditions? Since enrollment drives staffing in total and revenue, as well as assists with the whole process of staff allocation, this range of variability is going to force upon us a much more conservative approach than in the past when we are looking at our recommendations with respect to staffing that goes beyond that required by the collective agreements or by regulation. On slide 18 also identifies some of the normal cost pressures we see and revenue pressures. As Kevin indicated, one of the huge impacts we've seen is the change in childcare. We are not unique. The whole sector has suffered financially because of the increased requirements placed upon them in terms of safety, the change in enrollment patterns, and we will continue to work with our other school board partners, with the province of Ontario, to try to make sure that we continue to support a strong childcare presence in the city of Ottawa. In addition, we know that this year's experience with virtual learning is going to need to continue in some form next year. Even if we were somehow able to eradicate all of the impacts of the pandemic this summer, staff is of the opinion that the option of a virtual learning environment is here to stay. In the absence of additional specific funding to address this, we will need to reallocate dollars and staff from the existing pool to address some of the inherent costs associated with virtual learning. As we said, the entire childcare sector has suffered, and we are no different. We need to make sure that the province is aware that the continued existence of a vibrant childcare community, including the OCDSB's participation, is dependent on financial support. In addition, we talked about PPE. In addition to any of the numbers that are shown in the financial statements, there has been a massive injection of PPE delivered every month to school boards directly by the government, which is not reflected on our books. Instead, it will be accounted for between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Government Services. We don't wish to be overly conservative, but we know that in the absence of specific funding for some of those items, we will need to find our own resources. At a time of so much turmoil in our city, we want to make sure that schools can continue to be places of stability and safety for students, staff, and families. But we also have to recognize that we need to do that within the reality of the significant financial constraints facing us. It will be essential that we continue our strong advocacy to ensure school districts are provided with sufficient additional funding to meet these needs. This discussion has been ongoing through OPSPA, through CODE, the Council of Directors, COSBO, the senior business officials, and that continued level of support from staff and trustees will be essential to our work in the coming weeks. Finally, to timing. Madam Chair, slide 19 has been developed as a starting point. It identifies some of the work required to meet the usual ministry deadline of June 26th. Staff will be bringing forward to you soon a timeline that identifies, in addition to these, some of the key decisions that will be required that will allow that goal to be met. And this budget development timeline will be similarly updated. In closing, Madam Chair, you began by talking about questions and answers. Certainly is a night about questions and uncertainty. As we get additional information, which seems to come in weekly, we will be incorporating this into our decision-making. Anytime there's uncertainty, there's risk. In developing a budget to be recommended to the Budget Committee, your staff is going to be looking at ways to reduce the overall risk to the district if and when some of our assumptions prove to be faulty or incorrect, or to allow us the flexibility to use one of the new words of 2020 to allow us to pivot to take advantage of those opportunities. Madam Chair, in closing, if we were doing this in person at 133 Greenbank, I'd normally conclude by pointing to that character attributes we all try to model every day in our community of character. While we certainly face difficult and complex decisions in the coming weeks, I'm confident we can do so together. Madam Chair, in closing, we look forward to your comments and your questions tonight. We will attempt to answer them this evening, and if not, of course, we will continue our usual process of the budget question and answer updates. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CFO Carson and Manager Gardner, for the presentations this evening. I will now turn to the speakers list. I currently have 3 people on the list. And just a reminder, because we are in Committee of the Whole, we have a 3-minute timer that we have up on the screen. If people need to ask questions more than once, that's fine, as we are in Committee of the Whole. So I will just one thing to note that before we start going to the questions, CFO Carson, when you and I have spoken previously about this year's budget, I had asked the question about the timing and whether or not there may be a change that the province may provide with respect to when we have to have a final budget in to the province, and I didn't hear any reference to that in the presentation this evening. So if at some point tonight, perhaps you could just answer if we are in fact on that timeline to June or not, that would be, I think, helpful given last year's summer often spent in many meetings like this. So,
Madam Chair, maybe I'll just answer that. We have included the timeline that shows the conclusion on June, because at this point, the ministry has made no announcement of any particular changes that would extend last year's change in regulation past the end of June. In addition to that, even if there were more time available, obviously we would have to examine the circumstances. But we believe that if we are not in a position to approve a budget at the end of June, it significantly increases the risk of potential problems as we try to open schools safely and efficiently and effectively at the beginning of September. So as staff, we are currently assuming that we need to have something by the end of June. If more time is provided, we'll look at the circumstances, but we would certainly hope that there would not be a significant shift into the summer for that approval. So hope that helps.
thank you, CFO Carson. I thought that was an important point to set off our conversation for and questions for this evening. So I'll move to Trustee Penny, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, CFO Carson and Manager Gardner, for your presentation. It couldn't have been easy to come up with all these slides and figures, and well, we do need this good information. I'm just wondering, just a few questions. Wondering the $6.3 million loss, projected loss in EDP is very concerning to not only me, but to our parent community. because, as everyone is aware, we're supposed to be running that as a revenue neutral situation. So I'm just wondering what ideas we have to manage it better moving forward until the end of the year and likely into next year.
Madam Chair, I think there's a couple of pieces to this. The losses that are incurred are not related to the normal operation of childcare. They are specifically related to the impact of the pandemic and the changes that our community has faced. We will continue to work to achieve support. Some of those costs are costs that other childcares and other businesses in Ontario have been able to offset by the use of the federal wage subsidy program. We are not eligible to apply under that program, but in 2019-20, the province did commit that they would support our school board and others that were in that situation, and we did see those dollars come in. That discussion continues. We did not feel it was appropriate to record a receivable at this point for it, and so we do believe that we can recover a significant portion of it, not all of it, and it would not be our intention that we would, should we be left with a deficit, that we would try to recover all of it from users of the EDP program in a short period of time. These are unusual circumstances. And I know that Superintendent Dubois and the manager of the program, Julie Sear, are working in conjunction with other providers and with the city and province on a daily basis to try to make sure that everyone is aware of the circumstance. And as I said, to try to ensure as much as possible that when we come out of this on the other side, we have a strong program that we can continue to provide to our parents.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to page 5 of your report, the first bullet point, I need to be able to potentially explain that to my constituents, and it looks a little confusing to me. Could you expand on that a little bit? The one that starts increase of 2.3 million.
Kevin?
Sorry, your page 5 of the report package?
Yes.
Okay. And sorry.
Compensation related costs. And that first bullet point under that looks, it's just a little cryptic to me. I can't explain it to my constituents, so I'm wondering if you can help me a little bit.
Oh, okay. Yes. Thank you. And sorry that it is a little bit cryptic. It isn't meant to be. Basically, the $2.3 million was an amount that we had originally budgeted for, and that was approved in August. However, for our reporting purposes, in alignment on Appendix B that shows all our operating costs, that amount was actually reported as a non-operating cost amount. As part of the revised estimates and in accordance with the ministry direction that they had revised, that we had actually separated it out from the non-operating to report it as an instruction cost. So it's just a realignment. It's not an actual new cost, it's simply a realignment of a cost.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And referring to bullet points 2 and 3, it looks like the cost of virtual schools is, at least in the compensation aspect, is an additional $10.7 million, which is a little bit staggering, to tell you the truth, because, if I was a parent, I might think that we're using the same people that we were using for in-person instruction for virtual schools, and there's no additional facilities costs. So where do these costs come from? How can I explain that?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. The next 2 bullets are the COVID-related funding that we've received. So they're not necessarily directly all the costs for virtual schools. So there are all the different costs that we're incurring under the instruction envelope, including virtual schools. So you would have in-class supports through additional elementary teachers. So I haven't actually broken out all the different costs to reflect the true cost of virtual schools. And that in itself would be a little bit of a challenge to explain. Hopefully we'll get a better understanding of that as we go through our forecasting, but within this report, we haven't isolated those costs.
Madam Chair, if
thank
it
you very much.
helps, I might just add the main part of the provincial funding was applied to support non-classroom teachers, those the administrator positions, office staff, the additional support staff. It didn't cover all of those costs. Most of the cost of classroom teachers is in fact covered under the usual GSN, and that was being provided in the bullets. What we were trying to do is identify that some of the line items will look a little bit out of whack because we have not been able to totally separate the costing out for virtual the way we might have in a normal, if it were a normal program year.
Okay, thank you very much. One other thing, I see OCNet is reporting a reduction in the amount of international students and a reduction of revenue of 1.1, but an increase in administration costs of 210,000, which, you know, really doesn't amount to a hill of beans, but I'm just wondering how we can manage that better moving forward. You know, I don't like to see a decrease in revenue and an increase in costs. So any ideas?
Through you, Madam Chair, we are working with OCNet, so we are reviewing the costs, and I do expect that we'll see an adjustment as we go forward to really affirm what those costs should be. So although the revenues have gone down, I think the costs may have to also be reduced as we go forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question, I'm just wondering what the process is that, as far as the use of our accumulated surplus. It is mentioned in the report that the ministry is aware that we are planning to use not 1 or 2, but 3.2% of our revenues to make up for the deficit this year. So what is the process moving forward with that? How do we get approval for that, and what are the risks involved?
Madam Chair, Mr. Gardner and I have been in pretty constant contact with the contact in Toronto. In fact, the ministry came back to us and said, traditionally, your board is always too conservative at revised estimates, and we don't believe that you should be submitting that kind of a number in your request to use reserves. We're having that discussion now. Part of it was we were waiting for yesterday's announcement to see what rules might in fact apply to the dollars that came through so that we can work our way through it. Once we have it, there is a process that identifies the board requesting the ministry for that permission. It is then accompanied by what the province deems a deficit recovery plan. And that is a document and a plan that ends up usually being negotiated with the province. At the moment, we're looking to see what are the causes of this year's deficit. Those that are related to the pandemic, which may not have been addressed by the either the stabilization funding or the other, you know, some of those are self-solving as we move forward, as enrollment gets back to normal, as foreign students are allowed to return to the country. Some of those are going to fix themselves. Some of the costs that were incurred as a result of the collective agreements and the timing of them last year, those have a time limit on them. So we're optimistic that we can bring this forward without having to go to that 3% type of plan. But at some point, we will be reporting back to the board where we're at with that.
Okay, thank you very much, CFO Carson, and thank you very much, Manager Gardner. That's all for me, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Penny. I now have Ms. Granum up, and welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. Through you, Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. Gardner a question. You mentioned on one of your slides that there was a 4.6 million increase for vocational teacher costs. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a bit. I'm wondering about a breakdown between elementary and secondary.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. The $4.6 million increases was a very early estimate, and we will be updating that as we go along. We do recognize that there were significant requirements to quarantine as part of the pandemic. So a lot of the costs do relate to a provision for what we had been seeing during the development of the revised estimates. As for the breakdown between the elementary and secondary, I do not have that right now, but it's something that we could look into.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I would love to have that if you could pass that along when you know it. That's it for me, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Granum. Next up, I have Trustee Campbell.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for the report. My questions really are all to do with the extended day program, I think, at this point. May submit others later. Following on, I guess, some of those from Trustee Penny, perhaps. Can staff remind me, did we apply, I can't remember now, for a greater than 2% deficit, or did we hold ourselves to the 2%? I can't remember.
Madam Chair, the budget included a 2% deficit, and we do have, if we were to find that this amount could not be, is truly the right amount, then we would go back and look for ministry approval beyond that.
Madam Chair, my clock continues to move.
Yeah, okay. I'll give you a couple additional seconds there, Trustee Campbell.
Thank you.
Okay, I think your question got answered. Do you have another?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I guess in terms of the extended day, I know that we didn't project any shortfall in the budget. The revenue estimate went from 17.7 to 18.5 year over year, I believe, ballpark. And of course, we've had an important deficit. So the assumption at the time was that we would not be impacted in any way and effectively by COVID, and our revenues would remain high and in fact growing. I think this was questioned at the time, but I believe that the part of the reasoning was maybe a little bit speculative. We were looking at the 2%, et cetera. But in light of this, if staff do see potential COVID impacts progressing into next year, do we expect that we would take COVID impacts into account, or project a return to full, normal, I guess, EDP enrollment?
Madam Chair, I can begin. One of the reasons we did not, in our budget, include a major childcare deficit was we did believe strongly, we continue to believe there will be support beyond the regular GSNs to offset that deficit. But we did not feel, we could have gone two ways. One was to show decreased overall revenue, book a receivable from the province for the difference and do it that way. But I think that's because by the time we got to August, it was clear that the province, with support from the federal government, was prepared to commit significant amounts of dollars beyond what was in the GSNs to support school board. This year, we have heard nothing yet that would make us think that kind of generous support will continue to the same extent. So we will be more conservative in those kinds of estimates than we were, because we believe that, notwithstanding everything we do to try to ensure that the government understands the needs of school boards, we may have to be looking at those reduced amounts. So I think Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, you'll see us being more conservative in these areas until we see signals from the province that we have a reason to be hopeful.
Thank you very much. Last question, it's related, and that is with respect to, it was mentioned that we were topped up by the province to the city with respect to last year on EDP. Did we get full coverage for our shortfall, or was it something different, or how did that work out?
Madam Chair, it was based on a comparison to what you get through the wage subsidy program. I think the wage subsidy was covering, and I stand to be corrected, between 66 and 80% of the wages you would otherwise have seen. So again, I'm not sure the exact amount, but it was in that percentage of a recovery. I'm not sure, Prince, if you have a more exact number.
Thank you. Through the chair, I think we were subsidized approximately 70% last year.
Okay, thank you very much for everyone.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Campbell. I have Trustee Scott up next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One question for now, and that is relating to the funds that were just announced yesterday. There have been several references to needing to know just what all the rules are for those funds. Do we have any sense at the moment whether any of those funds actually could be applied retroactively, more or less, to things that we've already spend extra money on, or will most of these just announced funds require us to make new expenditures in order to qualify for the funds, or do we not know yet?
Madam Chair, we don't have the final answer. I believe that we will see most of it moving ahead with additional expenditures, which is what we would probably be looking at recommending in any event. The superintendents of business have raised a number of those questions. Some boards, like ours, proceeded with expenditures in November and December based on the minister's assertion that money was being identified and would be announced in December with respect to additional funding, for example, for technology or for ventilation. Some of us went ahead and made commitments based on that so that we could ensure timely delivery. So that'll be part of the ongoing discussion in the next week or two.
Is that going to be part of our advocacy then to the province to allow us to have the previous expenditures recognized where we did them in the expectation that those funds would be coming?
Madam Chair, I guess we'll have to look at it. To be honest, I'm of two minds, and as senior staff, we really haven't determined whether, in fact, we would even want to do that. We will have to make the decision. We may not have to do it yet. We may be able to postpone that and deal with it as part of a year-end adjustment. But we want to see it. The part that is in question is not the full 8 million. It's probably closer to 2 million. And so I don't know. I'm not sure we want to clutter up the discussion for the 40 million however we decide the big question, to clutter that with this as an item. I think, in early discussions with my colleagues, we know that the needs continue to be out there. And so I don't think we've made a decision yet.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Scott. Next up, I have Ms. Kirky. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Through the Chair, a question to Superintendent Carson. Thank you for your report. And I wanted to go back to your comments around the fact that the province has told school boards to not assume, or to assume that additional COVID funding will not continue into the 21-22 school year. And your comments around the need for strong advocacy for adequate funding for programming. And so I'm wondering, is there or will there be an advocacy plan brought forward over and above the avenues that you've already identified that are being sort of undertaken through OPSPA and Code and those kinds of organizations, a more public advocacy plan to lobby the government to ensure that our schools and our students are provided with the funding, and our board is provided with the funding and supports that we need to provide students with what we need to provide them, and that staff are able to adequately support with resources and supports for our students.
Madam Chair, I'm not trying to duck the question. I think that discussion has begun, and there'll be people. I am certainly not the expert in the right way to advocate. Kevin and I have one role, but I think that overall plan is a board decision. But I expect we will see something. But I think that might be an answer for another time or another meeting.
Okay, do you have any further questions?
If I could ask a supplemental, and I'm not necessarily looking for an answer, but I'm going to ask the question.
Please go ahead.
And would the board, and I say that broadly, including senior staff and trustees, be willing to engage in coordination and collaboration with community partners like the federations and families and other organizations in our school community to ensure that we can do the best that we can for our students?
Madam Chair, I think I can speak on behalf of the board that they will certainly welcome that suggestion and think about it as that plan's developed. But I can't make a commitment to Ms. Kirky.
Thank you.
Thank you, CFO, and thank you, Ms. Kirky. Next, I have Pat Dixon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Gardner. Are the budget estimates for OT costs based on projected replacement costs only, or do they include increased remuneration or supports such as training, paid training, for OTs in recognition of their important contribution to the OCDSB? And if not, why not?
Yes, through you, Madam Chair, the occasional teacher provision, although it's heavily weighted on the costs related to COVID absences, it does include all types of absences that are covered by OTs. So if it was for training purposes where we have occasional teachers coming in, definitely we know field trips are not there this year, but it would cover all occasional teacher costs. That line.
Supplemental, Madam Chair?
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. I understand replacement costs in all of its forms. What I'm asking is whether there was any consideration of additional remuneration or paid training for OTs in that budget line.
I cannot say with certainty that was a factor. We did a very high level analysis. So if there were transactions that were related to training, we would have captured that in there. If you're also asking about COVID specific related training, we did receive a grant to support those costs. And so those would be reported separately.
Thank you. I was not referencing COVID related.
Madam Chair, I think.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. Go ahead, CFO.
No, Madam Chair, I think the questioner is that may be something that I would suggest the questioner could follow up with Human Resources as to some of those specifics.
Okay, thank you. Is that it, Ms. Dixon?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And welcome to you as well. Over to you, Trustee Bell.
Great, thank you, Chair. The question I have is with regard to an equity lens analysis of our revised budget. What I'm thinking of is the question is, would it be possible to look at the spending that we've made this year from the lens of looking at what we have done to respond to COVID, to ensure that communities, traditionally marginalized communities, haven't been further negatively impacted by COVID? Would there be, maybe not this year, but at some point in the future, the possibility to do an analysis and get a line by line of where we actually spent money to support some of our more marginalized populations? So for example, I know that when we set out the principles, we committed to lower class sizes for raised schools. And I'm sure that there are so many other expenditures that we've made. CFO Carson, do you think that that would be possible at some time in the future to do that sort of analysis?
Madam Chair, we probably could outside of the budget process, but the reason I say probably, and I think I understand what the trustee is asking for. Right now, our financial system is set up for different purposes, but we know, for example, that when we received, when Superintendent Touage and her colleagues were looking at how we could allocate staff, particularly those staffing dollars that came through specifically related to trying to reduce class sizes, that some of those factors that were looked at by staff and the overall staffing committee reflected those needs of those communities. We'd have to go back in and take a look at some of that specific costing. And I don't mean to, I'm not whining. At the moment, we don't have the resources to do that. I think it's one of those things, though, that at some point we will want to look back and take a look at what, not only what did we do, but did it have an effect? And so that, I'm sure that will be one of the things that people will want to talk about in the future. But to be totally honest, I don't think we'll be in a position to do that for you this spring, to do that for trustees, at least not to the level I think you're looking for right now. We will, because we're going to be applying that sort of lens again this year. Obviously, we will be looking at it in broad terms, but I think I have to say, Madam Chair, it probably won't be to the extent that the trustee might be thinking about right now.
That's all for me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Bell. And Ms. Dixon, I still see your hand up, and I didn't know whether you were still wanting to be put back on the list or whether it's just a holdover from previously. So I'll move over to now to Trustee Lyra.
So building off of what Trustee Bell said and your response, Mike, you said that you're going to take an equity lens to the budget. You've also said that you take an environmental lens to the budget. And I'm wondering if you could, at some point in the future, I don't need an answer right now, sort of highlight for us what changes taking these lenses has made you take. I'd like to understand where the environmental lens and the equity lens have changed the budget making decisions so that we can point to these and say, this is what we as a board are doing differently because of the lenses that we have set we wish to apply. Does that make sense?
And Chair, we'll see how, we'll try to make sure that we, wherever possible, can identify that in some of our future documents as we come forward. Some will be simpler to show the link than others, but it is something we'll see what we can do for sure on it.
All right, thank you.
And was that it, Trustee Lyra?
Yes, that's what I was looking for.
Okay, thank you. I see no additional speakers. We are early for a budget meeting. Usually we have lots more questions, although this is the first of a few budget meetings. I'll just check then. If there are no further questions, we'll just move on in our agenda, but I'll just wait a moment just in case somebody has a pressing question that they want to raise their hand on. All right, seeing none then, I will move on to ask if there's any new business. Yes, Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to let everyone know in terms of advocacy efforts, I did make a presentation to the Ottawa Town Hall that was convened by the Minister of Finance last Friday, building from the letter we wrote with regard to the provincial budget in October, and adding particularly a little more emphasis on the importance of continuing some of the COVID supports, so that on the expectation that we would continue to need those supports come September. The oral.
It looks like Trustee Scott has frozen. Oh, Trustee Scott, are you still there? I think some people are having some internet connection issues this evening. I was earlier today, so I'm glad I haven't been for chairing the meeting. I guess I'll just take a moment and assuming that that Trustee Scott will come back in a moment, but
Madam Chair, while we wait
CFO,
for Trustee Scott,
yeah,
if I may,
go ahead.
The advocacy that we are making is not just about the amount of the funding, but the need for as early as possible identification of that. We need to be able to make decisions based on knowing the full parameters of what we're doing, and we need to. I think that's part of what we need. What we've been doing as staff is that if boards are expected to provide sound budgets and make the best possible decisions, an announcement in early July, mid-July does not help us, particularly since we can't implement for September. We'll be implementing in January, but it also certainly restricts our ability to make decisions. So I think that would be, I think the timely announcement was also part of Trustee Scott's presentation at that meeting on Friday. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, CFO. And that actually brings me, before we adjourn, just brings me back to remind folks about the schedule for sort of budget purposes this year. CFO Carson had a slide up reminding us of dates. So just as a quick reminder, our next tentative budget meeting is scheduled for May the 4th. However, that is also subject to change based on events and announcements as they unfold from the province. So those dates may shift. I think it's also important to note just that the academic staffing discussion is going to start in early March. So the 3rd of March, just to remind folks of the academic staffing discussion. The approval then scheduled for the 24th of March. Hopefully we'll have grants for student needs announced in sometime in April. We're hoping that it's not going to be in June this year as it was last year. And then we will meet again at the beginning of May with hopefully in hand and an analysis done by staff for the grants for student needs and with a budget to be presented later then in May on the 26th of May. So I do see that Trustee Scott is back. So before I officially adjourn, I'll just give her the floor because she did get cut off as she was speaking. So Lynn, I don't know, or sorry, Trustee Scott.
I'm back. I don't dare put my video on again.
No problem. Mike, sorry, CFO Carson did walk us through what some of the advocacy was and focused not just on sort of the numbers, but also focused on process and timing and making sure that that advocacy included sort of the broader picture. So I don't know if you wanted to
And
add.
I had only wanted to make sure that people were aware that I had done the presentation to the Finance Minister's Town Hall last week, and that presentation together with our October letter is available under Chair's Correspondence on the board website. And that was all.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Trustee Scott. I'm just wondering about the next special committee of the whole meeting. It is scheduled to start at 8:30. And because it is a public meeting, I'm guessing that we do need to adjourn now until 8:30. Looking to you, Michelle.
You're muted,
You're on
Michelle.
mute.
Sorry, I was just checking the start time on the meeting, which does say 8:30, and I'm looking for Manager Guthrie to confirm whether it said immediately following the committee of the whole budget or 8:30 or following.
We had indicated immediately following. It is difficult with all of the calendar apps to do that. And so it does say 8:30, but on the website, it also says immediately following cow budget.
Okay, so I suggest then that we take a short break because we are going to need to, because the meeting link is the same for the special cow meeting, we'll need to just sort of change over a few people. I know we've got some non-voting reps for the special cow meeting who are going to be joining us. So perhaps either Trustee Penny or Chair Scott, how do you wish to proceed? Trustee Penny, as you're going to be chairing the next meeting.
Thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz. I'm going to split the difference and say that, and remind everyone, the reps on the Committee of the Whole, if we could start at 8:20, I think that would be a good compromise for everyone. And if there is, if you are just a rep for the cow budget, if you could just maybe perhaps send a note to your colleague, so that we're going to start at 8:20, I'd really appreciate that. And with that, I think we're good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Trustee Penny. So with that, then we will adjourn until 8:20 for the next special board meeting. Thank you very much for everyone's participation tonight. And thanks again to staff for the great work in preparing for this conversation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's the appointed time when we are going to start the special committee of the whole meeting, and I'd just like to see if we have quorum. So if trustees could just turn their video on briefly, with the exception, of course, of Trustee Scott, who we don't want to lose, very much part of our thing here. So just to make sure that I've got everyone back, or at least we have quorum. Okay, so thank you very much. It looks like we have quorum, so that's very, very good. And I did hear someone ask off the cuff, why are we having this special committee of the whole meeting? And indeed, it's just to provide more time for us to have a little bit more for fulsome discussion on subjects that we felt needed some further discussion both now and at the committee of the whole meeting in the future. So that's the reason why we're moving forward. But at this time, I'd like to call the February 2nd, 2021 Special Committee of the Whole meeting to order and acknowledge that the meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin territories, and would like to thank the Algonquin nations for hosting us on their land. So at this time, I would like to call for a mover to approve the agenda. Trustee Ellis, thank you very much. Are there any changes to the agenda? And seeing none, I'd like to call the question on the agenda. All those in favor? And thank you very much. That passes, and we have an agenda. So moving on to item number 3, Matters for Action, Report 21-008, Purchase of New Portables. I'd like to call upon the Director to introduce the report. Madam Director.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. And first, I'd just like to excuse myself that I do have my camera off for most of the meeting because my internet too is unstable. So in the meantime, I would like to call on CFO Carson to take us through the report on the purchase of new portable classrooms, and he will be present to respond to any questions that may arise. CFO Carson, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just before I ask Mr. Bradley to take you through the highlights of the report, just wanted to cover a couple of issues. I know that since we've just finished a meeting where we discussed reduced enrollment and the uncertainty attached to that enrollment, it may seem odd that we are looking to acquire more portables. Having said that, this is part of that whole risk analysis that we look at. The additional portables will be part of refurbishing the existing fleet of portables. And while overall enrollment dropped, we had identified that if this had been a normal year, if we had not seen the pandemic-related reductions in attendance at brick and mortar schools, we would have in fact started the year with, I think, less than 5 portables that had not been allocated to schools. So we feel it is appropriate to proceed at this time. We are continuing to work with the ministry as to the source of fundings, whether it will be reserves or whether we will be allowed to access some of our facilities renewal dollars or other sources of funding that the board's already provided with. But it is something that we need to move on with. When we finally are able to open the new schools that we have been awarded, the 2 high schools, the elementary schools, that obviously will produce a surplus of portables. But what happens at that point is we need to address growth in other parts of the area, and it allows us to retire some of the older fleet. So having said that, Mr. Chair, I think I'll turn it over to Dan Bradley, our manager of facilities, who, as I said, can hit some of the highlights of the report.
Thanks, Mike. Through you, Chair. So yeah, the portable is seeking approval for 10 new portables, which is in addition to the 10 new portables we purchased last spring. That was in April 2020. Those 10 portables are fabricated and ready to be deployed throughout the district after staff do their spring allocation. The 10 new portables will be fabricated and ready for September of 2021, which will support any enrollment or pressure changes that arise at the beginning of the 2021-2022 school year. Attached within the report, you'll find Appendix A, which outlines the construction of our portables and details the environmental and sustainable features already built into the design. In addition to these features, staff are reviewing options for alternative portable designs and sustainable features by entering into discussions with research and development bodies across the province, including university sustainable fabrication firms and the National Research Council. In discussions with the NRC, they noted they're currently undertaking research in projects for sustainable and efficient both cost and energy structures for the north. So some of these features may be able to be incorporated into our future portable design, and staff will provide further information to the feasibility and options and long-term costs and benefits of these additional design features that potentially we can incorporate into future designs. That's it for now.
Okay, thank you very much, Manager Bradley. Anything else to add, CFO Carson?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And we do have questions from trustees, and I'll move to Trustee Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I wanted to thank both CFO Carson and in particular, Mr. Bradley for this report, and in particular the appendix. I know Dan and I had a conversation last week where we were talking about sort of who to reach out to in the community, in the research community and so forth with respect to portable design. And I think we had a really, really great conversation. I certainly, as I've been raising this issue for the last several times, we have portables that are being purchased. I really appreciated that I've been heard, that staff really have looked into sort of the construction and design opportunities. And I was very pleased to hear, in fact, and to see in the report that we're actually purchasing some already pretty environmentally advanced systems. There's lots more work, I think, that we can undertake as a board with respect to these units, as the lifespan of them is more than just a couple years, and then they get they're in our fleet for quite a long time. And so I really just wanted to commend staff and thank them very much for the extra effort to look into sustainability and environmental design in the portable fleet. And I certainly look forward to seeing what sort of partnerships may come about through the research entities that you're reaching out to. So thank you for hearing our concerns around sustainability.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And it sounds like you want to move the motion, Trustee Schwartz. Is that true?
I'm not going to move it this time because I still wish we had other options, and I will allow someone else to do the pleasure of moving it. But I thought it was important to recognize the extra efforts that staff have gone through.
All right, thank you very much. And then moving on to Trustee Ellis.
Thank you, and I will move the report. Excuse me, I have a cough because I swallowed something the wrong way. I'd like perhaps a little better understanding of where our fleet of portables are. It was mentioned that although we're not feeling an increase in enrollment, that many of these portables are replacing the stock. So I'm just wondering sort of how many on average portables are we retiring a year? Can we looking to the future, are we looking at, say, 5 portables every year to replace stock that are too old and not servicing? So a comment from staff on that would be helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll begin, and then Dan may have something to add. We do have changes in, sometimes we have to add portables because we would have an empty portable and it's just not cost effective to move it, depending on where it sits in a string on the other side of the city. We have been moving ahead with that. These are, the planning has indicated that we will definitely need these within the next year or two as we see the continued growth in those areas where we are constructing school, and that the portables that will be freed up by declining enrollment elsewhere in the city really isn't helping us. I'll let Dan talk about our work that we do on refurbishing portables every year, and our hope that we can begin to withdraw some from service and save some of those refurbishing costs. Dan?
Thanks, Mike. Through you, Chair. So we have about 405 portables in our fleet. Out of those 405 portables, we're currently sitting at about 60, I hate to use the term backlog, but that are backlog for upgrades. Annually, we upgrade, so that'd be completely refurbished, 8 to 10 portables. In order to maintain and stay ahead of the, we'll call it the renewal requirements, we'd have to do about 13 to 16. So that's why you'll see that increase at times in the portable renewal backlog. So the portable life cycle is about 25 to 30 years. So again, that's why you'll see that increase of backlog, because we only get to 8 or 10 annually.
Thank you. That's the end of my questions.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis.
Yeah.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis. And moving on to Trustee Lyra.
Okay. I've got a couple of questions. My first question is, I saw in the report that the minimum for the building code has been raised. Do our old portables meet the building code, and are they required to meet the building code on any particular time frame?
Through you, Chair. So the building codes and changes that happen to the building code are not retroactive. However, when we do the major modification or upgrades that I just talked about, that's when we'll bring that current portable, we'll say, up to code. So if we have any portables which we don't believe anymore that don't have ventilation units, that's something we'll add to it. We'll increase the insulation. We'll meet all the current standards that are required. And that's why you see we're only upgrading 8 to 10 portables annually, because there is some significant cost to bring it up to the current codes and standards. So short answer is, as they sit there and not touched, they're okay and left as is. As soon as we go to upgrade them, we got to bring them up to current codes and standards.
Okay. You said that we have 405 portables that are in our fleet. If we're upgrading 8 to 10 a year, that's 40 years before the current fleet of portable meets the standards that we just set. Is that a reasonable time frame to be looking at?
Through you, Chair. Well, that depends on changes to the code. There was a significant changes outlined in the appendix with the SB 10 as far as energy efficiency. But even though the code's changed, it still doesn't mean the performance in the portables is an issue. So I don't think we'd be looking at, we will be going through the renewal cycle as we have been for the last 20, 30 years, as long as we've been upgrading portables, but I'm not sure if we'd look to undertake all of that.
Okay. So the new portables that we're looking to build are going to meet the new code. Are they going to exceed the new minimum, or are we just setting pace with the provincial minimum?
So I'd have to look at comparison of the SB 10 as far as a minimum to what we're exceeding with, and the details within the construction of the portable. I don't know the exact details as far as a minimum insulation, for example, versus what SB 10 requires. But SB 10, I know just from the changes that were required, there was significant upgrades from the portables previous to SB 10 to what's built now. But I have to take a look at the details to prior to now and to what the code change has been, and compare to what our construction is to know exactly how far we are going above and beyond those minimum requirements.
Okay, I look forward to hearing about that.
Yeah.
We have bought new portables every year I have been on the board. At what point is it cheaper to build extensions to our buildings than to buy additional new portables?
Mr. Chair, it's a combination of the cost and the flexibility of where the space is required. Quite often, portables are used for temporary increases in enrollment, and unfortunately, that temporary can be as long as 5 or 10 years, perhaps 15. So they are two separate funding streams. They are, in fact, one piece of our puzzle, and we have had to make those investments in the last few years, partly because of the cycle and the age of the previous fleet, where we did have a period where, with the elimination of the 5th year of high school, where with changes in class sizes and everything else, we did see, in fact, a reduction in the number of portables. So it does float. Obviously, a class, we would prefer to have permanent additions when we can build a business case that the province is prepared to accept. But temporary accommodation will always be part of our plan to accommodate kids, I'm afraid.
Only at a school board would we say 15 years is temporary. So I'm wondering about washroom or other amenities in the schools that we have a plethora of portables. I know we have upwards of 10, almost certainly more at some of our schools. Are all of the amenities and all the extra things at those schools being met when we just pile portable after portable on?
Mr. Chair, they are, and in fact, it is one of the things that quite often complicates it. For example, the number of plumbing fixtures. In most cases, we're okay because a lot of those schools were built when class sizes were based on 30 or 40 students in a classroom. So the fixture count in most cases is over the average. Sometimes we have to have discussions with the city around their desire for increased parking. But in order to get the building permits, we need to be able to satisfy the city's requirements that we're meeting code with respect to those other conditions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. And seeing no further hands up, and I'm assuming that Trustee Lyra's hand up is just an artifact remaining. I'm going to go back to Trustee Ellis being the mover. And did you have a wrap up, Trustee Ellis?
Just to say that portables are a necessary evil at school boards. I find it distressing that we build a new school and we have to put portables pretty much from day one. But it's important that we stay on top of these things and we keep our stock renewed. So I hope folks will support this.
Okay, and thank you very much with that wrap up. And so I'd like to call the question on the recommendation of the report, which is on page 3 of the report, and that is that the purchase of 10 new modular portable classrooms at a budgeted total cost of $1.574 $600,000, excluding GSD, be approved and funded from reserves, subject to ministry approval. And the motion is now on your e-scribe. So please vote now.
Chair, I haven't, I'm not logged into eScribe right now, but I vote in favor.
Okay, thank you very much, Trustee Ellis.
Keith, it's Mark Fisher here. Same with me. I hadn't had a chance to log into eScribe as well, so it's going to take me too long before I can vote. So I vote in favor.
Okay. And I also see a message from Trustee Lyra. And so, Manager Guthrie, I have 3 votes from Trustee Ellis, Trustee Lyra, and Trustee Fisher. If that helps. All right, and that motion is carried. Thank you very much, everyone. And moving on to matters for discussion, item 4 of our agenda, report 21-016, electoral zone boundary review. And I'd like to call upon the director to introduce that report. Madam Director.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. As Executive Officer Giroux is present with us, she will indeed guide us through the report and respond to questions as they emerge. Executive Officer.
Thanks very much, Madam Director, and I'm very pleased to present this report to you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the work of Manager Nicole Guthrie and Board Services, and Janet McDonald and Julie Anderson from our planning department. They've done a tremendous amount of work to prepare us for this and will be instrumental as we move through this review. So you are probably aware that the City of Ottawa has revised its municipal ward boundaries. And this necessitates a comprehensive review of the OCDSB electoral zone boundaries. An electoral boundary review is part of the regular cycle in electoral practice and is necessary regularly to address population growth and to ensure that the electoral populations of zones are balanced. Excuse me. Electoral zone boundaries define voting areas. They are different from school attendance boundaries, and I'm confident trustees are aware of this, but it's an issue that is often unclear in the public's mind. So just to clarify, our school attendance boundaries are not driven by the electoral zone boundaries and are not affected when we change electoral zone boundaries. The City of Ottawa completed their ward boundary review in December 2020. It's the first comprehensive review the city has undertaken since 2004. The city hopes that these boundaries will be in place for the next 3 municipal elections, so that would take us to about 2030. The ward boundary changes that have been made reflect both actual and expected population growth, and particularly population growth in Barrhaven, Municipal Ward 3 and our Zone 3, Gloucester South Nepean, Municipal Ward 22 and our Zone 7, and Cumberland, Municipal Ward 19 and our Zone 8. The city increased the number of municipal wards from 23 to 24 and now has 12 urban wards, 9 suburban wards, and 3 rural wards. So as I explained, most of those changes are focused on the areas of population growth, but there are some other smaller changes. The city made every effort to minimize the number of changes and to protect communities of interest. You'll see on the maps that planning has prepared, and I believe it's in the report, that there is an impact on several of our electoral zones. Zones 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, 11, and 12 all have some impact, although the extent of the impact differs quite a bit. As I said, there are maps in your package that you can take a look at. One of the things about electoral zones when we take a look at them is we want the electoral populations to be distributed fairly evenly, and we work with an electoral quotient of 1. And in appendix, I think it's appendix A, you'll see the electoral quotients of our current zones, and you can see what that range is. We also work with some guiding principles. So we want to protect communities of interest. We want to recognize present and future population trends, and the city has done that. We recognize physical or geographical features as natural boundaries. So often that would be rivers, major arterial roadways, railway lines, things like this. Those form natural boundaries. And of course, we respect the principle of rep by pop. What's unique about electoral zone boundaries is our zone boundaries have to be based on the municipal ward boundaries. And so an electoral zone for the school district can be comprised of 1 or more municipal wards, but the wards that are combined must be contiguous, so they must be touching at some point, and we can't sever any part of the zone, of the ward. We have to use the whole thing. So in all likelihood, we will see electoral zones that are comprised of usually 1 or 2 wards, in cases of the rural wards, sometimes 3. One of the good things about the city's redrawing of boundaries and restructuring of wards is there are now 24 electoral wards and we have 12 electoral zones. So mathematically, they might fit a little bit better in terms of distribution. So in terms of what's next, we've got this presentation to the board, and then we will be generating some material on the website to indicate to the community, make the community aware that we're going to be undertaking a zone boundary review. We have some time. The process will run. We'd like to have a decision made by December of 2021. And the reason for that is twofold. So one, we need some time, well, threefold. We need some time to generate some models and to bring them to you for discussion and then take them out for public consultation and then come back for approval. While we are doing that, the city is going through a legislative process in terms of finalizing their ward boundaries, and there are appeal timelines and other things that the city has to have regard for. So the new municipal ward boundaries are formalized after some of those appeal processes and things have moved through. We would like the board to have its decisions made by the end of this calendar year, so that when we start 2022, which is a municipal election year, we're pretty clear on what those electoral boundaries are, so that candidates who are interested in running can start thinking about their plans. There is a legislative process we have to go through between January and March 2022. That's called the Trustee Distribution and Determination Process. And what we hope is, if we have our decisions made by the end of December, then that process is just a fairly straightforward legislative compliance process. So after tonight's presentation, we'll begin digging a little bit deeper into the ward boundary changes and looking at models and starting to see what kind of models align and what the electoral quotients are when we combine different wards. We'll come back in the spring, probably in June, with some draft models. And then those will be the models that will be ready to take out for consultation. There's quite a bit, once you do the modeling, there's quite a bit of mapping involved. So we do need some time to plan for that and to plan to be able to explain what the proposed changes are in simple language. So we look to do that consultation in September, October. Present a report to you in November for discussion with final approval in December. And then, as I say, the legislative process and the required dates by February. So that's a very quick overview with lots of information about a fairly complex process. We presented this as a discussion report. The board has to undertake a review. And so we're happy to answer any questions you might have about the review, any thoughts about how we might approach it, or any things you would like us to watch for during the process.
Thank you very much, Executive Officer. And we do have some questions, starting with Trustee Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just as I look at the map in Appendix B, I just am not totally clear on the red on the map versus, I know what the current zone boundaries or the color coding for the zones is. But so the red delineates then what the new city wards are, and those have already been approved.
So the city
where I'm
has
not clear.
approved its new boundaries. And those are the boundaries that are delineated in with the red lines. And our electoral zones are inside of those lines.
Yep.
And so you will see in some areas where the city has made a change. The easiest one for me to look at is in our zone 2.
Mm-hmm.
You will see that the red line extends, that would be Canada, extends a little bit more into Canada North. And so that was previously part of zone 1 and we'll be moving into zone 2. So we'll be assessing, for example, what's the population impact of that?
Okay. And so where there's some that, and I'm thinking like if I'm looking at zone 12, which I currently represent, there's now a boundary line for zone 8 that kind of cuts right through sort of my current zone, and then there's a whole bunch of zone 8 that could potentially be put into zone 12 instead. Which
So
would be like
the municipal boundaries did combine rural wards and rural
Okay.
sections of Cumberland and Osgood.
Okay.
There
Okay,
isn't
that's helpful.
there isn't yet a very neat summary description. In simple terms, there's lots of legal description about the changes, and we will work to clarify that. That's why we want that time between June and September, but we will try and put that into simpler language.
Okay, no, that's helpful to understand. Thank you. It just, there was a lot of red where there was crossover into lots of different zones, and so that's what I wasn't sure exactly what we were looking at. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz. And moving on to Trustee Campbell.
And thank you very much. I guess just a question, would staff be, when they do their comprehensive review, be looking at different number of trustee options, or would staff not be looking at that as a set of options unless there was clear direction from the board ahead of time in that regard, you know, because of the modeling investments and that kind of thing?
In terms of reducing the number of trustees, is that the root of your question?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The number of trustees?
That's correct. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So we're currently precluded from that by some language in the, I can't say off the top of my head if it's in the Education Act or in a regulation, but the number of trustees for the OCDSB is currently set at 12. So if there was any interest in changing that number, we would have to go through a process of appealing to the ministry, and that would make this process much more complex.
Okay, great. If you could, I'll check. I thought that we were fixed at between 10 and 12 based on our numbers, but I'll look for that, and maybe if staff could confirm as well.
I'll double check, but if I'm not mistaken, historically, there was a process for determining the number of trustees. It was based on total population, and there was a range. But I think it goes back at least 2 elections, because it's not clear in my head. There was a regulation that set the number specifically.
Really? Okay. So I'm sure they wouldn't mind if the board resolved. I guess that it's just possible. I just put it out there that the way the wards get divvied up could just work out so much better, you know, potentially if there was a reduction of 1, there may be a big advantage to it, right? I know that the city looked at 25, 24, 23, and even outliers like 17 wards when they opened the box and they looked at all kinds of options. And, you know, if the city can do that, I don't know if we shouldn't be doing that. But maybe just something to consider if there's something that is an obviously important benefit. The other, I guess, question / suggestion I have is when looking at models, I think I caught from the staff presentation that be looking at student or sorry, voter projections, public board voter projections out to 2030. It strikes me that just sort of a common sense proposal that we would want to right size in an ideal world, which we don't live in, the zones based on something like a midpoint 2026, right? Because, you know, you have basically equal amounts of under and over representation within that, you know, a 8-year range. You know, it's just an idea rather than going to the end point necessarily. And just a final thought, which is that if it ends up coming down to, very close calls between different scenarios, and there might only be one like blindingly obvious scenario, you know, I don't know how this will turn out, but it might be useful to have other information available, such as not just number of electors, but number of students, number of students attending the zone versus a neighboring zone, number of schools, that kind of thing. Because I think those things perhaps do affect, maybe not formally, but in a practical sense, I think the ability of trustees to represent possibly. Anyway, it's just an all things being equal kind of consideration. It might be something that could be looked at.
So
just some ideas.
Sorry. A few things to respond to there. So the city originally looked at 5 different significant options. And I'll note that in their comprehensive review, they did hire an external consulting team to do the work, because it is a significant undertaking. particularly when you're doing the long-term population projections. The difference for the city and us is we have to follow the city's direction. So they've made their population projection decisions, and we have to work within that. We have to assess what the number of public school electors is, but we still have to work within this framework. So that's one piece to think about. In terms of the right sizing, though, the board has that opportunity legislatively protected in each election cycle, because that's what the trustee distribution and determination process does. We still have to work within the city boundaries, but when there is an election and we go through that distribution and determination process, it actually means trustee distribution and determination is how do you distribute those trustees amongst the electoral wards and determining the number. So that is the natural, I think, correct, that will help you settle on that mid-year point. I'm hopeful that mathematically this will work out a little bit better this time, 12 trustees and 24 wards. But in terms of giving the board more information, we did the last time we did this, quite a detailed matrix of electoral population, number of elementary schools, number of secondary schools, number of electors, and I forget what other factors in there, but we'll look to use that as a basis for our analysis.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Executive Officer. And moving on to Trustee Lyra.
So I want to first comment on the fact that we are drawing our own electoral districts, and I think that's kind of silly. I know it's not our choice, but this just screams gerrymandering to me. My first actual question was to echo Rob's question about what feasibility we have to lower the number of trustees, and we heard an answer to that. My second question is, what is the greatest differential between trustee populations that the board is willing, or that the staff are willing to recommend?
So I don't think that we can say right now what the greatest differential we're willing to recommend is until we do the modeling. We know that the legislative requirement is an electoral quotient of 1 plus or minus 0.25. So you'll see that if you look at Appendix A, the distribution we currently have, I think there are some quotients that are below that range, but that was the series of trade-offs that we made when we looked at the possible configurations. And so we'll want to go through that exercise and understand where are those trade-offs, and maybe the distribution will be better this time, maybe it won't. One interesting observation off the cuff, I mentioned the increase to Zone 2, which would be Canada North, and you'll see that Canada is currently on the high side. So that would increase that a little bit, but maybe not exponentially higher. Maybe all of these ranges will be higher. I don't know that until we get into the data analysis. So it would be premature for me to speculate.
Sorry, did you say that there was a legislative requirement that we not be more than plus or minus 0.25?
The trustee distribution and determination process, which is established by regulation, asks the board to establish its boundaries using an electoral quotient of 1, understanding that there will be a range. You can vary plus or minus on the 1, but ultimately the boundaries are submitted to the province for review. So that's what happens when we do that process. So all of that to say, to your first concern, there is a second check in the process.
Okay. The reason I asked is it wouldn't be, if it was a requirement that we not be plus or minus 0.25, we don't meet that right now. And so we could not just leave things status quo. If it's a recommendation that it's 0.25, we could opt to leave things mostly status quo, except for some of the ones that have changed a little.
I think that, so first of all, this current scenario has been submitted to the province and was approved. So we know that what we have in place was considered acceptable. To the next question, one of the things that the City of Ottawa did when they looked at their initial reports, because you may recall, they initially had, I think it was 5 options. And when those were presented, the consultants were asked to go back and come up with a 6th option. And that 6th option was intended to address the biggest population changes, which were those 3 changes that I mentioned, and then make every effort to maintain the integrity of the existing boundaries. And so that's sort of inherently built in to the parameters that we're working within.
All right. I'm going to go away and think about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. And moving on to Student Trustee Liu.
Yes, thank you. I read the report and I did want to kind of follow up on what Trustee Lyra was asking. So I hope I didn't miss it in the report, but I did want to ask like why we are drawing our own map specifically. Is it because we have to account for like specifically households with children and school location to draw our own specific boundaries? Or is it because, for example, like on city council, they may decide to add a ward, whereas we're just redistributing the geography over existing population of trustees. So I did just first wonder what our reason for drawing our own boundaries would be.
Our electoral zones have to conform to the electoral zone boundaries that the city establishes, to the municipal ward boundaries. And so given that the city has changed their boundaries, we have to change ours in order to fit. So we talked earlier about some lines that were changed. And so those lines have to change on ours. The city has 24 wards now. They had 23 wards previously, and we have 12 zones. So we have to figure out what the right distribution of our 12 zones is to those wards. And this maybe touches on your question and one somebody else answered. I will point out that other school districts, including our coterminous district, have a different number of trustees. And so the municipal wards that they combine to make their electoral zones might be different from ours. It's a fitting the city's boundaries to our structure and vice versa.
Oh, right. So does that tie into the thing about the report where it's like a trustee electoral zone or cannot be composed of like 2 or more or 1 or more of the municipal zones or something?
It has to be composed of 1 or more municipal ward boundaries. Okay. And the wards that a zone is comprised of must be contiguous. So we couldn't, right, for example, mathematically, you might be able to get everybody at 1.0, but 1/2 of your constituency would be in Orleans and the other half would be in Canada. You can't do that.
Okay, thank you. Also, so I know the report highlighted that one of the first consideration listed was protecting communities of interest. And I wondered if you could expand on that. Because I know, and I also wondered how, for example, underserved neighborhoods were considered in the process of creating these boundaries. And this is turning into a 3-part question. And lastly, whether or not the Ottawa Neighborhood Equity Index would also be a resource or a tool used in consideration through that process.
Okay. So in terms of communities of interest, in the case of electoral boundaries, we're looking at that in terms of what are the issues that affect a community. So for example, the easiest one to think about is our electoral zone for Canada, which has Canada North and Canada South. So that was the former city of Canada. they, you know, and we may be years away from that now, but at the time they identified very much as a community of interest. One of the things, sometimes communities of interest remain steady over time and sometimes they change. So for example, if you look at Riverside South and Longfields Davidson, those were two communities that were historically divided by the river, which would be a natural boundary line, right? And there wasn't a bridge in that part of town. And so there was not easy access between those two communities. So they would not have been considered communities of interest necessarily. The way that community growth has happened, there is a bridge, as we know, and there's quite a bit of traffic east-west across that corridor. So we might today rethink the communities of interest in that area. So we think about, where do people travel? What is the area people identify as their community? How does that work? That sort of piece. You asked about underserved, I don't know if you said communities or schools, but that same issue of communities of interest would apply to sort of all parts of the community. So when we think about boundaries, are we severing or splitting a community? You know, does it make sense? We get into this in the downtown wards, which ones fit best together? You know, Bay Ward, which is currently I think our smallest ward. If we were going to attach it to another ward or zone, which we've looked at in every zone boundary review because it's the smallest one, which one makes the most sense from a community pattern, from a schools, from a size, all of those pieces? Where do the people travel? Do they consider themselves part of that same neighborhood? Is there any boundary or barrier? Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, and just the third part, I'm sorry, I threw so much at you at once, would the Ottawa Neighborhood Equity Index be potentially used when trying to assess like community needs? Just because I think it's a great resource, very detailed, very thorough. We contributed to it ourselves as a board, and I was just wondering whether your team would be using that.
It's absolutely a great index, and we do use it in a lot of things. And we'll have to take that forward into our review and think about how it would work in this context. And we'd have to look at the data and see what it tells us. Remember that we don't get to define the boundaries from the beginning. We get to take the puzzle pieces and say, this is the outside of the puzzle, and we can fit the pieces together this way, but all of these pieces have to fit inside the frame, right? So we'll look at the index and see. I talked about the matrix that informs our decision-making. We'll see if it could be a factor. I'm just not clear enough in my head right now about how that data source would be used.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Student Trustee Liu, and moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try the video, just hoping it holds. I wonder if we could have some comment on the differences across the city in terms of what counts as population for the purpose of calculating our zone electoral populations, because I think that's one of the key differences, that the city wards are designed based on total population, but each school board's electoral population is specifically and only the people whose municipal taxes are directed to support that particular board. And there's quite a shift as you move from east to west and from north to south.
So it's a really good question, and it's one of the challenges in this process. So I talked about the legislative process, the trustee distribution and determination process. That happens between January and March in an election year. And the value of that process is that the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation is required to provide school boards with an electoral population report, which actually gives us the real number of public school electors. We won't have an up-to-date PEG report for this process. We are in contact with the city, and we'll look at the data they used, and we'll look at the data we had from our last population report, and we'll work with our planning department, and we'll try and make the best projections we can. The last thing I would say to that is the advantage we have as a public school board versus our coterminous boards, either French or Catholic, is that every elector is considered a public school elector unless they qualify to be otherwise. So on that basis, it is a little bit easier to do our estimating based on averages and other things, but there still is a bit of a difference there. And when we do that matrix that I mentioned before, we will look at total population and our electoral group population.
Thank you for that. I guess the one thing I can't forget, and this goes back years to before the city of Ottawa was as it is now, with the gradient across the city between English and French language and between Protestant and Catholic in religion. It used to be that the city of Nepean, for example, had 5 trustees on the former Carleton board. The city of Gloucester, which had the same population roughly as Nepean, only had 3. And it was very difficult to explain why they were only 3 from Gloucester, but Nepean, that greedy Nepean, had 5 board members. And things have shifted somewhat with the growth and the change in the city's demographics, but I think it's really important to have a very good look at how that impacts how many wards can be combined in any particular area. Because if you have 2 wards that have a lot of population but not a lot of public school support, they may still have to be combined. Where other smaller wards that have a lot of public school support, even though they don't have the same population, may well be able to sit on their own.
Absolutely.
And that's all.
Thank you very much, Trustee Scott. And we have some questions again from Trustee Lyra. Go ahead.
Something that Student Trustee Liu said sparked a question in me. Is there going to be any consideration to neighborhoods with a lower socioeconomic rating being perhaps outweighted when it comes to, or overweighted when it comes to who gets to be the 0.9 or the 0.8 versus who gets to be 1.1 or 1.2? Unless we are very, very lucky, we are going to end up with some variance between trustee zones. And I'm wondering, is any consideration going to be given to trying to increase representation of communities that are historically marginalized?
So I guess the starting point is, and I addressed this in part before, we are not talking about communities, like, for example, when we talk about school attendance boundaries, we get much more into the small neighborhood level. When we talk about electoral zones, we get into much larger, or not always larger, but denser areas. And so as a rule, there tends to be a broader range of community types within a ward. Now, that's not true consistently across the city. We know that. And that's why, if we think about this from a land use planning perspective, the city looks to range plan for different types of housing stock and different needs in all parts of the city, right? And so we can take that guidance about looking at the neighborhood study and looking at underserved communities into the process, and think about where and how we can address that. but we have to work with the pieces that we have. So maybe where that becomes a factor is if when you do the modeling, you're looking at a couple of models, and we had this case in the past where, model A has, I said in our current case, Bay Ward or Bay Zone is the smallest. So in model A, that's the smallest, but this is the makeup of that neighborhood, versus model B, this would be the smallest, but this is the makeup. So we might, when we get to that level, but until we do the modeling and look at the other factors, we won't know that. So that's how I think we might be able to bring it into the conversation.
Okay, so it is going to be a factor that you consider when you make recommendations to the board about which model you're going to recommend.
So it can be a factor that we can look at. And remember, we don't know right now what the possible distributions look like. So, the scenario I said where we weighed off, it's possible we come up with a distribution where everybody's at 1 and it works out. I don't know that yet, is all I'm saying, but certainly I understand. I hear the concerns that are being raised about how do we bring equity into the conversation, and we'll continue to look for ways to do that. And what I gave you was one example where we might be able to do that. There may be others, I just haven't explored them yet.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Lara. Moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple more questions. Do we have any sense of the likelihood of the growth areas that the city has considered for the new ward boundaries actually happening within that roughly 10-year time frame? I guess what I'm looking at is the little piece that's being added to Canada out of the West Carleton area on the map, which is a brand new chunk of subdivision north of the Morgan's Grand area, reaching out to roughly St. Isidore Catholic School. There is a community design plan in place, but I have no real expectation that any of that or any significant amount of that will be built in the next 10 years. There are other areas where there are community design plans elsewhere in the city where there's not any solid expectation of just when those things will actually happen. And for example, we're still waiting for growth in some parts of the Fernbank lands around Stittsville, which hasn't happened yet, although some of that is now starting to come on stream, but it took a long time to happen.
So we will need to go deeper in our understanding of the city's changes as we work through this. When we started our conversation with the planning department and we reached out to the city, we at that point weren't even able to access the maps that would allow us to overlay our maps onto their maps. So our planning team, Janet and Julie, have done an amazing job starting to do some mapping given the information that was available. And I believe that the city's shape files are now available. And so that will allow us to do more modeling. But we definitely need to go deeper in their recommendations and understand the impacts. And that'll come in our next report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Scott. And moving on to Student Trustee Liu, go ahead.
I wanted to ask one more question. When the electoral boundary review has been done in previous years, and when we may, as a board, have changed these zones or these boundaries in the past, I was wondering, has it tended to be more of a sort of geographic process where you look at just kind of communities by name, for example, Barrhaven, like Beacon Hill? Has it tended to be that type of more just kind of like geography and looking at just the setup of different like neighborhoods by name, or have like social lenses been applied to the review and to the drawing of these boundaries? Just because yeah, I was wondering when you mentioned previously like communities' interest, you typically reference like existing sort of neighborhoods in that sense and more of a geographic sense than a social one. So I was wondering whether, you know, the social factor to any point like plays into the considerations that your team makes.
So the first place that has to happen is in the municipal review, because that's what establishes the pieces that we have to work with, right? And so the city, I think there's quite a bit of information on the city site about the parameters for their review. I know that when we participated in their consultation, there were some other community agencies that were participating in that conversation, and who may have been advocating for some of those social concerns as you identified. Our task now is to combine those pieces and think about how do we meet those first criteria, and then how will we apply some of those other questions that you've asked. So again, I think we'll continue to look at how do we do that, but it is, there are a series of factors, and the fact that the zones have to be made up of contiguous wards makes it a boundary thing from the outset, right? We have to put connected pieces together, but we can think about what are the pieces, and are there social factors in those pieces that either define communities of interest and make more sense to go together, or are there social issues or factors that might make us think, from a representative framework, it would make more sense to combine these other two instead. So to that extent, absolutely.
Great, thank you for the clarification.
Thank you very much. And Trustee Campbell.
Thank you. One request, I guess, please, the staff. I found the regulation. Thank you very much. And I was stepping through it, but I confess, I read it and reread it. I got lost in the interclausal references between the regulation and the act. But it does seem to me that there may be a provision to reduce by resolution of the board. The calculation is very prescriptive, takes into a number of factors, but notwithstanding that, I believe there may be a provision allowing for that. But if I could just, if maybe staff could find the time to come up with the absolute skinny on that and relay that back, that would be appreciated.
Well, you absolutely will. That was always the case. And if I'm not mistaken, and maybe I am, it's been a few years since we looked at it, but if I'm not mistaken, there was a directive at one point from the province that fixed it at 12 and eliminated that provision. I can't remember what format that directive came in, so that will be key. Maybe it doesn't apply any longer, I don't know, but that's what we'll take a look for.
Okay, super, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This more by way of a comment than a question, but there's been a lot of concern expressed around what really is meant by communities of interest. And I think one of the things, given that we're dealing with fixed shape and fixed size puzzle pieces here, one of the things that you have to look at, if you look at the map with the city ward boundaries overlaid on top of the colored existing electoral zones, if you looked, for example, at doing a recombination here, say you decided you were going to break up zone 1, which is oddly enough the one I know the best, you might consider what different way to take the West Carleton March ward and combine it with something else. It does touch on Rideau Goulburn. It also touches on Stittsville. It touches on Canada North, and it touches on Bay Ward. Would it make a lot of sense to combine it with Bay Ward? Well, given that there isn't even a road that goes directly from Bay Ward into West Carleton, that might not be the greatest idea, because there really is very little travel or communication or shopping connections or school connections between those two areas. On the other hand, with Canada North, there is quite a lot, because people shop for groceries in Canada. Their kids go to recreation things in Canada, and we have a modest number of school students who cross the boundary between Canada North and West Carleton, either going to West Carleton Secondary or going from the West Carleton March area to South March and Jack Donahue schools. So when you look at the community of interest thing, which would it make more sense to combine, Canada North and West Carleton, or Bay Ward and West Carleton? The same kinds of considerations would apply when you start looking at the Barrhaven area, and again when you start looking out in Orleans. Certainly when they were looking at the city wards, there was a lot of concern in part of Cumberland that they didn't really have that much to do with the Osgood area. They did change the boundaries, but they didn't take the whole of rural Cumberland and attach the whole works to Osgood. So when you're looking at those kinds of considerations, you know, do you put a fast growing suburb with a piece of very long established city area, or do you try to keep the pieces together where people are used to dating? And I think that's probably one of the most important parts when we start considering which wards combine the best for our purposes for providing education governance. And that's all.
Absolutely. And Trustee Scott's right. The other piece is recognizing whether those things have changed. So a good example is we currently combine Barrhaven and Knoxdale Marieville. 20 years ago, the combination would have more likely have been Knoxdale, Marieville, and College Ward, because in the old city of Nepean, that's how those wards were configured, and that's what was generally thought of as the alignment. But that has changed over time, we will need to be thoughtful about that as we go through, and we're fortunate to have the planning folks working with us to help us out with some of those things.
All right. Seeing no further hands up, I'd like to thank you, Executive Officer Drew, for not only a good presentation, but answering all those questions. Many questions on that. That's good. And I guess that sort of concludes our discussion for this evening on that matter. And with that, we'll move on to our agenda to the last item, which is adjournment. And since there's no item called new business, I'd like to call the meeting adjourned. And Trustee Scott, did you have something quick to say? No?
No, I was just trying to figure out how to get my thumbs up down again.
Well, thank you very much. And so I'd like to declare the meeting adjourned, and good night, everyone. And we'll see you at a later date.